Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, coordinator and producer for the Stop Vax Passports Task Force. Today's webinar is part of our ongoing webinar series focused on topics of concern regarding Communist Chinese pandemic response policies, including mandates for vaccines and centralized compliance, tracking digital technologies, which are, we believe, a gateway to tyrannical social credit scores, mass surveillance, and mass population control. A video of this webinar will post to stopvaxpassports.org within a day of the conclusion of our program. Our other webinars can be found there too. Please share this with your elected officials, friends, colleagues, and other networks. Our co-host and moderator today is Frank Gaffney, Chairman for the Center for Security Policy and co-chair of the Stop Vax Passports Task Force. He's also co-founder of the Sovereignty Coalition to Exit the WHO. More information at sovereigntycoalition.org. With that, Frank, let's get started.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of some of the most remarkable webinars I've certainly been involved with and have been acquainted with, sponsored by others. The Stop Vaccine Passports Task Force is what I call a pickup team of people who have, particularly under the sponsorship of the Committee on the Present Danger China and our partners at Women's Rights Without Frontiers, joined forces to try to address issues of the utmost importance involving not just our personal freedoms, but the constitutional republic that guarantees them, against assorted adversaries who are intent, it seems, on not just diminishing those freedoms, but crushing that sovereign republic. One of those adversaries at the moment, which is enabled by a number of others, is the World Health Organization. It is familiar to some Americans for the very counterproductive, indeed, I would say diabolical performance it turned in the course of the first pandemic 3 years ago. It is now, if the World Health Organization's Director General, Tedros Ghebreyesus, and his friends in the Chinese Communist Party, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, Big Pharma, plutocrats like Bill Gates have their way, intent on expanding enormously the powers of that organization. Today's webinar will complement previous webinars and update some of their important findings with respect to the real danger associated with further entrusting authority, let alone absolute control over public health in this country, to such a seriously deficient organization as the World Health Organization and its co-conspirators. We're going to talk about specifically one of the vehicles that is in play at the moment to give the World Health Organization these expanded powers. It is not always described as a treaty, but it is, in fact, a treaty and should be considered by the United States Senate as such. We'll be talking in the course of this program about why that is, what the stakes are, and why we must ensure that the United States withdraw from this organization if it is in fact granted these far-reaching and extremely sovereignty destructive powers. We're going to start with our co-host, co-sponsor of the Stop Vaccine Passports Task Force, and a regular contributor to these programs, Reggie Littlejohn, Esquire. She is a Yale-trained attorney. She has 8 years or so of practice as a litigator and years, indeed decades, of accomplishment in legal analysis and the research that supports it, some of which she has brought to bear as very important skills in assessing the nature of this current version of the draft treaty. Some call it an accord, others a framework agreement, but for the purposes of our discussion today, I think we will demonstrate, thanks in part to Reggie's extraordinarily important analysis, that it is a treaty and, again, must be treated as such. Reggie, it is wonderful to have you with us, as always. Thank you for your leadership in putting this particular program together and the extraordinary group of participants we have to speak after you do. Over to you.
Thank you so very much, Frank. So on June 2nd, 2023, the World Health Organization issued its most recent iteration of the pandemic treaty. So here it is. They gave it a catchy name. The name is Bureau's Text of the WHO Convention, Agreement, or Other International Instrument on Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness, and Response, WHOCA+. So you'll notice they didn't call it a treaty. They called it anything but a treaty. And one of the things that we need to establish here is this is a treaty. I mean, you may have heard some confusing messages that, number one, that this is not a treaty. Number two, that it has nothing to do with sovereignty. And number three, that because we have a new draft, all the analysis of so many people in the movement on the previous draft is now invalid. And I would take issue on all three of those statements, and I will tell you why. First of all, let's talk about whether or not this is a treaty. So according to Encyclopedia Britannica, citing the Vienna Convention, which defines treaties, a treaty is, quote, a binding formal agreement, contract, or other written instrument that establishes obligations between two or more subjects of international law, primarily states and international organizations. So basically, a treaty is a binding agreement between nations. That is precisely what this new, I'll just call it the new Bureau draft of the pandemic treaty is. And it states so. It says right here on page 1 that this is an instrument between nations that should be legally binding. So it's a treaty. And I would like to say that trying to say that it's not a treaty, contending that it's not a treaty, I am at a loss as to how this is a helpful thing to do, because that's what the WHO is trying to do. They're trying to say it's not a treaty because they don't want it to have to pass through the treaty process, for example, the U.S. Senate. So we're just basically acceding to them if we say it's not a treaty. So secondly, you might have heard that this treaty has nothing to do with sovereignty. Well, what is sovereignty? According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, sovereignty is defined as, quote, supreme power, especially over a body politic, freedom from external control, autonomy. Okay, so the new pandemic treaty would destroy national sovereignty. It would be the WHO exerting external control to issue binding directives regarding how the U.S. or any other country would handle a health risk within our own borders. It would also destroy our own personal sovereignty and medical autonomy by doing things like ordering forced vaccinations. So you may also have heard that because we have a new draft of this new pandemic treaty, that all the analyses of the previous drafts need to be thrown out the window, and we just have to start all over again. And I take serious exception to that view. Now, I sat down and compared the zero draft, which is the original draft of the treaty, with the current new Bureau draft, and they are substantially similar in very important areas. Number one, censorship. Number two, surveillance. Number three, One Health. And then number four, the treaty adds a whole new thing, a whole new body called the Conference of the Parties, which is very concerning. So let's just go over these. in the new Bureau draft of the treaty, we have Article 4 on surveillance. The parties shall take prevention and surveillance measures that are consistent with and supportive of the effective implementation of the international health regulations. All right. Right there, you got the connection between the international health regulations and the pandemic treaty as the enforcement arm of them. So anything that's bad in the international health regulations is going to be enforced by the treaty. And there's more. I mean, here's another one. Article 5.7D. All right. Implementation of One Health surveillance mechanisms using data collected from and shared across human, animal, and environmental sources. So what does that mean? It means that they're going to be surveilling humans, animals, plants, the environment, all of it, to see if there is some kind of a health risk involved. That's a huge amount of surveillance. And just to demonstrate that that is true, there's a new article that came out recently. Here it is. WHO adopts European-style COVID-19 vaccine passports as part of the new global digital health certificate. Here it is. All right. This is how the WHO is implementing surveillance through these vaccine passports. And what they can do is, if these pass in conjunction with the international health regulations, and if you choose not to be vaccinated or not to get your booster or whatever else, this vaccine passport can implement the China social credit system, including, for example, forcing you into quarantine and making it so that you can't, shutting you off from your bank account and your credit card. I mean, we've talked about this a lot already, so I'm not going to go into more detail about that. But let's look at censorship under the new draft. Article 18: the parties shall tackle false, misleading, misinformation, and disinformation, and they shall conduct regular community outreach, social listening to identify the prevalence and profiles of misinformation, to counteract misinformation, disinformation, and false news. So that's in both drafts, and it's incredibly important. What it does is it sets up the World Health Organization as an international ministry of truth, and people who contradict their narrative are going to be censored. They're going to be surveilled through social listening. So, our social media accounts censored. And then if we don't agree with them, or we don't just get in line, then they will come down on us. They will have the power to come down on us through the vaccine passport digital ID system. One Health is a focus of both the zero draft and the new Bureau's draft. And according to the Lancet, and we had a whole webinar on One Health, I would commend that. But I just want to point out one thing, that according to the Lancet, that One Health connects human health, animal health, plant health, and the environment. Here's a quote from the Lancet article, One Health, a call for ecological equity. And here's a quote: all life is equal and of equal concern. So if all life is equal and of equal concern, then your life and my life and our children's lives are not of any more concern than the life of a cockroach. And therefore, human life is not going to be prioritized, which, in my opinion, is an assault on religious freedom. Many of us believe that human beings are unique, that we were created by God in his image. And that is something that we do not necessarily share with animals, and that our lives are more important than the life of the cockroach. But under this One Health, they are focusing on the interface between human health and animal health. In my opinion, this is a way, and of course, all of this is a hijacking. Of course, human health is connected to animal health, but they can hijack it in order to do bad things like land grabs. So there's a new thing that's kind of coming up now. It's called Bat One Health, having to do with bats. And they have teams all over the world to try to see the interface between bats and humans. Why are they doing that? Because their argument is that zoonotic viruses are going from bats to humans. And what are they going to do with that? Are they going to try to move humans away from bats? In other words, away from rural areas, this is something that's rife for abuse. And I want to just end with talking a bit about on this Conference of the Parties, which is a whole chapter in the new treaty. And I will just say one thing about it. It is rife with potential for abuse. And we can drill down, and I can tell you chapter and verse, but in Article 32 of this new treaty, as it is written, the Bureau's draft is ambiguous and could be interpreted that a small committee, even that would be called a session within the Conference of the Parties, could adopt a proposed amendment. Okay, so this is the thing. As it's written, it looks like the Conference of the Parties itself can amend the treaty, and it can even be a small committee that can amend the treaty, and that they are not required to make it public, what they are considering. So they're depending on the goodwill of the United States or whatever nation to make it public, but we can't count on that. And that this could be implemented within 90 days of acceptance and just completely circumvent the whole treaty process, the whole amendment of a treaty process that should happen. This is very dangerous. It's very dangerous for them to be able to amend the treaty and completely circumvent the treaty process worldwide. So that is like a 30,000-foot view of the problems with this new draft, why it's so dangerous. And the only hope I think that we have is to exit the WHO. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie Littlejohn of Women's Rights Without Frontiers. A perfect send-up to the on-site inspector that our Sovereignty Coalition was privileged to have at the World Health Assembly, at least in the preparatory portion of the program. And she has been keeping close eye on what has been going on in Geneva, as well as here in Washington, D.C., and raising in an incredibly effective way alarms that we all need to take heed of. She is Michelle Bachmann, a former very distinguished member of the United States House of Representatives, representing the people of Minnesota. These days, she is the Dean of the Regent School of Government, named after Pat Robertson. She is a formidable champion of individual liberty and the American Constitution, which she, of course, on a number of occasions swore an oath to support and defend, have unfortunately altogether too many who seem to have forgotten that they did so, or at least are honoring their oath in the breach. Congressman Bachmann, thank you so much for all you have been doing on this important cause and for joining us today to talk a bit about your insights from Geneva and where we go from here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, a part of this important webinar. We've heard great information so far from Reggie Littlejohn. So what are we talking about and why are we here? What we're talking about is the loss of sovereignty, not only in the United States, we're talking about the loss of sovereignty of 194 nations across the world. That's virtually every nation on earth is looking at voluntarily giving up its sovereignty over healthcare decision-making. And when you look below the layers, it is far more than just healthcare decisions that are at risk. It's virtually almost every decision that a nation would make is at risk. Because what this means is if those who are successful, who are in the process of putting this new system forth, what they will be creating is a global governance, a platform for global governance. For the first time in history, certainly in the modern era, but in history, we will see a platform for global governance. It is in alignment with the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, and it is being operationalized by the World Health Organization, as was stated by my colleagues in their previous presentations. So again, what are we talking about? Loss of national sovereignty. That's an existential threat to the United States. We will no longer exist in the way that we have previously if this goes forward. Our lives will never be able to be lived the same in freedom, in decision-making, decisions based on liberty. In fact, our form of government, which is a representative form of government based upon a constitution, that will effectively be gone. That's what we're talking about. That's the level of the alarm that we're talking about. So global governance, a platform for global governance is in the process of being created. And in fact, this month of June of 2023, as Reggie Littlejohn stated from an article that she held up, that system is being operationalized. And that is an agreement that was announced at the early part of June that the European Union and their executive committee, the European Commission, made an announcement together with the World Health Organization, which is the healthcare arm of the United Nations. They said that the global digital passport on vaccines and on healthcare, what Europe used throughout the pandemic, if you will, that system is now going to be run by the World Health Organization. Why do we care? Well, let's talk about what it is. Take out your cell phone and imagine a QR code on your cell phone. For those of us who didn't live in Europe, we didn't know what they were dealing with. They had a QR code, which is a digital identity. Each person had a digital identity. It was on their phone in the form of a QR code. In order for someone to get on a subway system or be able to travel in the EU, they had to take that QR code, put it over a reader, and then they would be allowed to access transportation. So too, if they wanted to buy something in the marketplace, food or household items or any item at all, they would have to use their phone and that QR code to then be able to purchase. Well, what's wrong with that, you might say? Well, there's something wrong with it if the World Health Organization uses as a barrier the ability to be able to buy or sell, or the ability to be able to travel is only dependent upon whether or not the World Health Organization says you have met its criteria. You've had enough vaccines, you've had enough boosters, you've had enough testing requirements. Then you can go forward and you can travel or you can buy something. Why is this important? A government official from Indonesia said last November that in this May at the World Health Assembly that met in Geneva, Switzerland, they were going to be passing and they were going to operationalize the global digital passports so that everyone would have a digital ID, every person on earth. And from there, they would begin to utilize and operationalize this system where we are constrained. We are not able to travel. We are not able to buy or sell without that QR code as approved by the WHO. This is huge. I think we can all see this. Effectively, what this digital QR code would do, this is the enforcement mechanism. This is the platform for global government. So your phone with your QR code controlled by the WHO, that's global government. That's what it looks like. That's the enforcement mechanism. And the shock is that when I was in Geneva at the World Health Assembly, this issue wasn't spoken about. I thought for sure we would have a vote. They would talk about it. They did not talk about it. Instead, they were pragmatic. They acted. So as Reggie and others have talked about, there is the legalized framework that they're trying to build with the Global Pandemic Treaty and with amending the international health rules for the purpose of the overall goal, which is global government and the loss of individual national sovereignty. Again, for the purpose so that the World Health Organization under the United Nations, it's the United Nations for all practical purposes, they would be able to surveil, track, and trace our lives, and they would be able to determine whether or not we can travel or whether or not we can buy and sell. Let's fast forward to what happened in June. We know, as Reggie had mentioned, that there was a press conference and that now the WHO is running effectively this global digital passport that is interoperable. It can be used among various countries. All countries of the world are expected to be in the system. That became operational now in June of 2023. So it's already there. It's already operational in 80 countries in Europe. That's an economy that's almost equal to the United States of America, and you have a population and a land mass almost equal to the size of the United States. So the question is, when is the United States going into this system? The expectation is that we will. The expectation is that the rest of the world will go into this system. This is very big. Just several weeks ago, I got a videotape from a businessman who was in England He wanted to go into an Aldi's and just buy some food at the grocery store. And he took this video on the wall at Aldi's. He took the video of the directions on using your QR code on your phone to get in. He then swung his camera over and he filmed the barriers that there were to even walk in an Aldi store. So this wasn't just purchasing the food at an Aldi's. He had to show that his QR code was operational in order to even walk into the Aldi's. He couldn't even get to any food. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because this isn't pie in the sky years down the road. This is this month, June 2023. Global government is being implemented and enforced in June of 2023 in Europe. The system that will be used for us in America, for Canada, for all nations on earth, it's being implemented and begun this month. It is operational. It is active. Global government has begun over Europe. And so here's my question. Why have we heard nothing from the U.S. Senate? Why have we heard nothing from the House of Representatives? One colleague who was in Geneva with me went to Washington, D.C. to be a part of a meeting to specifically ask some very strong, conservative, actually biblical members of Congress, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to pull the United States out of the World Health Organization? Are you going to begin to hold hearings? What are you going to do about the WHO? Or are you going to pass Andy Biggs' bill, H.R. 79? And he said, probably not. No, we're probably not going to have hearings. You know, we really don't see that this is quite the problem that you think that it is. And here's our situation that we're at now. If these members of Congress can't see this after all the documentation that is laid out, after all the video film footage, after the articles that say this system of global government is operational today in Europe, then we need to, if they're not saying anything, then we need to. And we need to demand that they get us out of the WHO. So Frank, thank you. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, Dee Dee. It's extremely important. We're operationalized today with global government, and we've got to get the United States Congress to wake up, take action, and get us out, because this is the Biden administration's plan for America. And we need to ask these senators and House members, when are you going to get us out of this system and make sure that we are not forced to have an individual digital identification? Thank you.
Congressman Bachmann, thank you. This is hugely important, and I think you've properly put into context the vastly larger agenda that is at work here. This is not simply about empowering the World Health Organization, or for that matter, any other of the various multilateral organizations. This is about putting into place all of the elements of global governance that crush the sovereignty of the United States, among other nations, of course. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate so much your leadership in this space, and look forward to talking with you further about it in the days to come. Next up, we're going to get perspective from someone who has been, as I'm fond of saying, inside the belly of the beast, a medical doctor by the name of Dr. David Bell, who has been a public health physician and a scientist at the World Health Organization. He is today a senior scholar with the highly regarded Brownstone Institute and a biotech consultant on global health. He knows whereof he speaks, in short, when it comes to the nature of and the inadvisability of strengthening the World Health Organization. We've asked him to address the topic of why deferring to the World Health Organization on pandemic prevention and preparedness makes no sense. Dr. Bell, welcome back to these webinars. We're delighted to have you with us. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Frank. I think Reggie and Michelle have covered quite well the fact that this is a treaty by any other name. And what it is doing is handing over the aim of the treaty and the international health regulations amendments that go alongside it is to hand over the power that is currently held by governments over citizens in democratic countries, that power is held at the will of the citizens. And to hand that over, the governments will undertake to give that power to a single person who runs the WHO, the World Health Organization, who can then dictate public health measures, which previously have always been within the role of a government and the role of communities. So it is a treaty is where you change sovereignty, you give powers over your citizens to other people. That is what is being done here. But we need to step back a bit and think, why are we even at this point? So the World Health Organization, it is an organization that is very significantly privately funded. So this is the organization that powers will be handed to. It's funded by corporations and individuals who have gained very strongly from the COVID event of the last 3 years and will gain very strongly from the pandemic. So there are huge conflicts of interest. This is being driven by people who are looking to make money out of the powers that are handed over. Secondly, the organization is constituted by 194 countries. 50% of those countries are not democratic states. They're military dictatorships, one-party states, etc. So a democracy handing over powers to such a body should be a non-starter from the beginning. So in terms of track record, is the WHO competent? So over the last 3 years of COVID, we've seen through the policies that the WHO has been pushing on the world, an increase in the diseases that were the traditional remit, such as tuberculosis, HIV, malaria. We've seen 100 million extra people in severe malnutrition, infant mortality rising. We've seen schools closed for up to 2 years in low-income countries, which is locking in poverty on a global scale for the next 1 to 2 generations. And this was done despite the WHO having put out guidelines in 2019 for pandemic influenza that said never under any circumstances do these things. And the reason for not doing them, as it was stated then, is that they will increase poverty and they'll have very little impact on the disease that you're trying to address. And that's exactly what's happened over COVID. So we're handing powers to an organization that isn't competent to do what it's being asked to do, clearly. So secondly, the WHO is not a pool of expertise. It's an organization that is constituted by bureaucrats, many of whom have been there for 2 to 3 decades. It's based on country quotas, which is quite appropriate for an organization that's just giving advice. But so it's not pulling people on based on their expertise, but on very much which countries they come from and often who they have worked with in the past. So there is far more expertise to manage health emergencies in the United States, for instance, obviously, than in the WHO. So it is beyond inappropriate to hand power over health emergencies in the US to an external body with less expertise. So lastly, in terms of public health, it's well recognized that centralizing responses is the wrong way to go. And we saw that during COVID, where the same responses were put on the United States, on northern Italy, on sub-Saharan Africa, where populations are completely different. They have very different priorities, different cultures, and different disease burdens. So centralizing public health in this way is the last way that you would want to address a highly complex health emergency that spanned across the whole world, like a pandemic, if that occurs. So if that occurs, it's important. We've had, according to the WHO, about 3 pandemics in the last 100 years. Each of those, even COVID, we've had less life years lost than diseases such as tuberculosis per year. And in terms of diseases, related to diabetes, related to, heart disease, cancer, etc., even in terms of mortality, COVID hasn't killed as many people in somewhere like the US, where recorded mortality was high, than has died from those diseases. So we're dealing with a rare event unless people release a virus or modify a virus and it escapes. This is naturally a very rare event. And it has a relatively low disease burden compared to what we deal with every day. But in this context, they're asking in this treaty and the documents around it for over $30 billion to be devoted to this per year. and $10 billion of new money. Now, the WHO's budget at the moment is just $3.5 billion per year. So this is a ludicrous amount of money for a minor disease burden when other diseases and poverty are getting worse throughout the world. So, and what the treaty will do and the health regulations that are related to it, they're building a bureaucracy, and this is already happening. As Michelle mentioned, this is going forward, a huge surveillance bureaucracy, which will find viral variants because this is nature, and will then lock people down. There will be a 100-day vaccine developed by CEPI, it's an organization alongside WHO, and it'll be an mRNA vaccine. They will offer that vaccine as a way out of the lockdowns that these same people just imposed. We've heard about the QR codes, etc., that will ensure that you will have to have a vaccine in order to travel or in order to carry out normal tasks of normal daily life. So what this will do in handing this power and handing this money and building this bureaucracy is ensure that what happened for the last 3 years for COVID will become a regular event, including the increasing impoverishment, the increasing inequality in wealth, and the increasing way that wealth lands in the hands of the people and the corporations, particularly big pharma and software, that are very heavily pushing this whole agenda. So on all these counts, it's not, even disregarding the treaty and sovereignty aspect, it is a completely inappropriate way to go from a public health point of view and from a democratic point of view. So it's hard to understand why we've got this far, but it is clear that this isn't about public health. There is something that we really need to understand backing it all up. Thanks, Frank.
Dr. Bell, thank you. Your insights are indispensable, and thank you for bringing them so forcefully to bear in this conversation. We're going to turn next to a man of great experience in matters of international law. His expertise is, I think, in the arms control space in particular, but he understands the law intimately and has been a practitioner of it with great distinction. His name is Dr. Francis Boyle, professor of international law at the University of Illinois and a Harvard Law School magna cum laude graduate, a PhD in political science as well from Harvard University, former board member of Amnesty International, a draftsman of implementing Act of Biological Weapons Convention, and a man who has seriously studied the matters at hand.
I have asked Dee to distribute a handout to you entitled The WHO Worldwide Totalitarian Medical Police State. It's an interview I gave that I revised and edited and corrected. And it goes through all of the legal documents involved here. I have studied both international law and international organizations starting in 1974 at Harvard Law School, which was the world's leading place to study both subjects at that time. It is no longer the case today. And then I spent 2 years teaching international law and then international organizations to undergraduates at Harvard. And then in 1978, I came here. I was hired to teach international law, a course on that subject, and international organizations. That deals with the entirety of the establishment of the United Nations organization in 1945 up until today. In addition, in my scholarly activities, I have studied every international organization going back to the start of the modern era of international organizations with the First Hague Peace Conference in 1899. You can find that in my book, Foundations of World Order. Now, in all that experience of 50 years teaching, writing, studying, practicing international organizations, international law, this is the first time ever that globalists have attempted to establish a worldwide totalitarian police state. And I've studied all of them. I'm not here to defend the United Nations organization. I gave a lecture last week in South Africa condemning them in no uncertain terms. but even the UN Secretariat and bureaucracy are not set up as a worldwide totalitarian police state. If you read the Bureau text and the amendments to the regulations, both of them are set up to establish a worldwide totalitarian police state. And the lawyers who drafted these documents knew exactly what they were doing when they drafted them. And I go through some of that in my paper here that I would encourage you to read. In addition, then, we also have the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023 that has already, by means of Congress, paved the way for the domestic implementation of either the amendments to the regulations or the treaty or both. And it clearly says, this is Congress at the start of 2023, to facilitate national capacity to comply with and adhere to. That's mandatory language, to comply with and adhere to other relevant frameworks that contribute to global health and security. That means both the amendments to the regulations and the treaty itself. The way has already been paved by this legislation to set up a worldwide totalitarian medical police state that will apply here in the United States. What happened was that we saw massive resistance here in the United States to all the totalitarian edicts coming out of Washington, D.C. during the COVID-19 pandemic. So they are now planning for the next pandemic. And they know the next pandemic is coming because it is coming out of their own biological weapons laboratories, BSL-3s and BSL-4s, just as COVID-19 came out of the Wuhan BSL-4, working in conjunction with the University of North Carolina BSL-3. You can read about this in my book, Resisting Medical Tyranny. I have all the documentation in there. They have these biowarfare agents already developed and stockpiled and ready to go. For example, the UNC BSL-3 has worked on applying gain-of-function activities to Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS, which has a 33% lethality rate. So the next pandemic is coming out of their labs, and it will either be deliberately released or it will be an accidental leak. Take your choice. So this time, they don't want any opposition here in the United States. So they are blue washing the entire operation. They are going to the WHO. They are getting either the treaty or the regulations or both. And when they get them, Reggie is correct. This is an international agreement. Both are under the terms of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. So they will then bring this back here to the United States and say, these, either the regulations or the treaty or both, are the supreme law of the land under Article 6 of the United States Constitution, and in conjunction with the National Defense Authorization Act, they override the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution that gives control of healthcare, public healthcare, to state and local governments, not the federal government. And so what they will then be able to do, the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., the Bidenites, is to override all opposition by governors, state and local authorities, general assemblies elected by the states of the union, your public health authorities, etc. And so basically you will have Tedros over there in the WHO giving orders all the way down the line through the White House and the CDC about how your primary care physicians should treat you. And I would say mistreat you, criminally mistreat you. We see the criminal malpractice by the WHO from the outset of this pandemic, as David Bell has correctly pointed out. And so all opposition, they will attempt to sweep aside with the next pandemic that they are already planning for. And so you will have to do whatever orders come out of the WHO. And if the governor, the attorney general, the local public health authorities do not comply, they will go into United States federal district courts, which are part of the system, and they will get contempt orders against local authorities to pay massive fines or criminal or civil contempt, putting them into jail and demanding that you do exactly what the WHO has told you to do. My reading of all these documents put together, this is a trap that has been set by the American people and against our constitutional system of government and against our republic. And the only thing that we can do now is to exit the WHO immediately. Thank you.
Dr. Boyle, thank you. And I think your testimony is singularly crucial, especially to the point that Michelle Bachmann mentioned at the outset, the response that she has received from at least one member of Congress that there's really nothing to see here, folks, that it's just not, a case has not persuasively been made that there's a problem along the lines of what we've just described. We hope that your testimony here and elsewhere will very strongly rebut that false premise. We're going to speak next, speaking of medical doctors and their relationship with the patient. I'm going to go a little bit out of order here, if I may, to Dr. Carla Dean Graves, who has been, as a doctor of osteopathy, very much in the fight to try to treat patients in her professional best judgment during the COVID crisis. I think very much benefit from her thoughts as to whether a WHO on steroids is likely, as Dr. Boyle has suggested, to become vastly more coercive and destructive in terms of personal sovereignty of individual Americans, as well as our national sovereignty. Dr. Graves, thank you, and forgive me for taking you out of turn, but I know you're good to go. So over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate this very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank you, Frank and Reggie, both for having me on this panel. I want to do a little bit of history. In 2019, I received a call from a fellow colleague saying that we in the United States could be faced with a major infection that may be crossing the globe. This individual had come into contact with an ophthalmologist in China. And of course, we know that that ophthalmologist was trying to get the message out that he was seeing many that were dying from what he thought was probably either a leaked virus or an intentional release of a virus in Wuhan, China. And we immediately began our investigation as to what we might be able to do. And we did discover, as a team, that the hydroxychloroquine was used by Dr. Fauci in the HIV times in the 1980s. And so we immediately began researching what might be able to help our patients. So we did come up with a protocol of azithromycin and later on ivermectin and then hydroxychloroquine. However, we quickly found out that that was being shut down. Not shut down because it wasn't effective, because it was very effective, but shut down because our own government was shutting down the use of the hydroxychloroquine and, of course, the ivermectin. Now, that was on a recommendation from the World Health Organization. That was a recommendation. Can we imagine how it would be if it was a mandate? Because what is going to happen is that all treatments, protocols, are going to be set by the World Health Organization. And it will be only those medications that they have deemed to be of usage for patients to be actually basically legal. Now, what has happened across the United States in this last time when we were faced with the SARS-2, then we had many physicians who actually had their licenses not only threatened, but also taken away. We had individuals taken off of hospital staffs and actually removed from their medical clinics because they were using the hydroxychloroquine and the ivermectin and the azithromycin and some other medications, but to actually save lives. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to remind ourselves very far in our memory what it was like for those people who mostly went to the hospital. They didn't come out. They were wrongly put on ventilators. They were wrongly given remdesivir, which caused actually renal failure, not just a temporary renal failure, such as you might see in other conditions, but for the most part, permanent failure. And so just imagine that we have another pandemic and they have actually set the protocols, but yet we know that there are other medications that can be used, but we will be actually not able to use them because they will basically be called illegal, and we will be threatened should we use them. Why was this? Why? Why did they do this? Because many of you may know, and some of you may not know, that when you have any type of a treatment that is available, you cannot release a emergency use authorization. And that emergency use authorization was what was actually used and actually is still in place for these COVID injections. And so they would not be able to actually put out those shots had we had an alternative treatment. This is nefarious. This is tyranny. And if we don't think that we are not at war, we had better think again, because the antibiotics, most of the antibiotics that we use in the United States of America now are actually manufactured in China. Almost all of our generics are manufactured there. And so can you imagine actually asking China for the medication for something that actually they have released, and not only to us, but to the entire world? Ladies and gentlemen, we had better think again before we turn over our sovereignty, not only of health, but of life, because they, meaning the World Health Organization, can call anything they so choose a pandemic. They can close down a region, a city. They could put us in lockdowns, mask again, and it will be mandated this time. Ladies and gentlemen, let's think. What kind of an America, what kind of a world do we want to live in? Right now, the World Health Organization has actually aligned itself with not only just the medications, but also with our foods under the Food Organization, the Agriculture Organization in the UN. And they are actually thinking about making things such as garlic and mint actually a medication, and it would be under scrutiny, and it would only be able to be prescribed by physicians. Can you imagine this in America? Ladies and gentlemen, it is happening, and it is going to happen. What can you do? What can we do? Well, I come from a Christian standpoint of view, and so I say I start on my knees, and I start praying, and I ask the good Lord to help us and to give us insight and protection. Then I think what we should do and what you could do it today. You can go to the sovereigntycoalition.org and you can sign our declaration. And that will actually help us to give this to our legislators and to show them that Americans do not want outside interference. We thought our insurance companies were interfering with our medical practices. Can you imagine what this could do? I want to thank you, and I appreciate your time, and I hope that each and every one of you will actually go to the sovereigntycoalition.org and take a look at our website. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Grace. We're going to hear next from another doctor of osteopathy, Dr. Kat Lindley. She has also been very actively engaged with a number of associations and organizations, both prior to the pandemic, including American Academy of Physicians and Surgeons, of whose Texas branch she is president. She's a family physician and the co-founder of the Global Health Project, as well as a member of our Sovereignty Coalition. She has deeply studied what is going on here and has reached conclusions that are very much consistent with those we've heard before, but that I think she brings a special authority to on the subject of whether, in fact, other mechanisms upon which we have relied going back to the founding of this republic for our freedoms, to be able to prevent the kind of tyranny that is now in the offing. Dr. Lindley, we're very glad to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for having me. I believe everyone has already said some very important things, but some things probably are worth repeating. So even though the World Health Organization failed miserably in the response to COVID-19 pandemic during these past 3 years, currently, with the pandemic treaty and the amendments to the IHR, they are trying to expand the authority of WHO to be able to declare another pandemic, and as such expand an international bureaucracy for health emergency with an additional annual budget that's estimated by the World Bank to be 3 times the current budget of the WHO. So in one of the articles, they point out that the nation's members shall raise financial resources to implement the treaty and commit not less than 5% of the national health budgets to be devoted to the health emergencies. Under this pandemic treaty, WHO would focus on early detection and prevention of future pandemics, universal and equitable responses via vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics, and a stronger international health framework with WHO in charge and One Health approach. This One Health approach would connect the health of humans, animals, and planets. So the language is not that bad when you read it, but when you really dig deep into it, One Health, as written, includes not only human health, but also the health of animals, agricultural plants, and the environment. So through the concept of One Health, the WHO would have control over every aspect of existence on Earth. And they would not need to prioritize human health, but rather they could choose to balance human health with animal and plant health, as well as environmental health under the guise of climate change. Other things that are very concerning is Article 18, where the treaty calls on parties to tackle false, misleading, misinformation, or disinformation, thus forming their own version of Ministry of Truth, as I like to call it. So the obvious concern with that is that this would specifically interfere with the United States Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When it comes to the IHR amendments, the pandemic treaty always has to be looked at together with the IHR amendment because they work hand in hand. But when it comes to the amendments, these amendments to the IHR would give WHO authority over member states, countries by changing the wording from non-binding to binding recommendations that now would mandate the member state countries to follow instead of just consider the recommendations. So countries will have to accept the WHO as the authority in international public health emergency over their own health agencies. And this is that point where a lot of people feel that this is undermining our sovereignty. So these amendments will also change the definition of public health emergency of international concern to include not only actual threats, but also potential threats that the Director General could deem necessary to consider. So big take-home points really for me are that these previously encouraged recommendations will now become mandatory obligations that needs to be followed by the member nations. And also WHO will be able to, on basis of perceived emergency or threat, implement travel restrictions via Global Health Digital Passport, border closures. They could mandate lockdowns, masking, vaccinations, approve diagnostic tools and treatments. And all of this in the name of pandemic preparedness under One Health, One World. And as such, this would interfere with fundamental patient-physician relationship. So as a practicing physician, if there is another potential concern, my job is to really discuss with my patient what is the right thing to do, how to go ahead and treat it or not. But if we, with these amendments in the pandemic treaty, if they are accepted, ratified, and so on, they could mandate how this relationship develops. And I think that's very much concerning for all of us. And I'm a little bit like Carla Dean, what next? I think important things to do is look at all of our states and see if there's any kind of legislation that can be implemented on the state level, and if not on federal. And definitely going to sovereigntycoalition.org because there's lots of information there. There are several bills in Congress right now, and we need to get our state representatives to actually sign on to those bills so that they can be brought to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lindley. I just want to say that this point about the sovereigntycoalition.org site that both Dr. Graves and Dr. Lindley have mentioned has a feature that enables you not only to sign the declaration, we call it the American Sovereignty Declaration, but also very easily with the click of a mouse or two to communicate to your elected representatives in the Senate and in the House of Representatives that you do not want them to go along with this treaty or the international health regulations for that matter, or let alone a combination of the two. So we will be talking about this momentarily in questions. But before we get to that, I'm very pleased to have with us as our cleanup batter a man who has participated in a number of our programs in the past and always does so with extraordinarily impressive insight into the challenges that we're facing here. His name is Alex Newman. He is a contributor to, among others, the Epoch Times and a wide array of esteemed publications. He is an award-winning international journalist, an educator, an author, and a consultant who co-authored the book Crimes of the Educators: How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. He has been studying closely what I think of as international organization warfare as a vehicle for effecting the kinds of transformation that we've been talking about throughout this program. And he is able to illuminate both the ways in which this warfare is being waged and the stakes that I think will provide a very impactful conclusion to this program. Alex Newman, it's terrific to have you with us. Thank you for your time today. Please, the floor is yours.
Great to be here. Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you, Reggie. Thanks to all the panelists. Fantastic comments. It's an honor to be here. So I want to focus in on the digital health ID, the digital vaccine passport that is coming. This is not a hypothetical threat. This is already well underway. In fact, the World Health Organization announced recently a partnership with the European Union where they are going to be working on this digital health system. And it's much more than a vaccine passport. Right? I want to be clear. The threat is not hypothetical in that we've already seen where this goes, right? During the 3 or 4 years of COVID emergency, we saw in multiple countries, in multiple jurisdictions, these vaccine passports, so-called, being used as a tool to determine who can buy or sell, who can be active in the marketplace, who can go and in some countries even go to the grocery store, right? I'm sitting in Sweden right now. Digital IDs have become ubiquitous. You now use them for your banking, for your parking, for any interaction with the government, for leaving the country, for coming into the country. Just got on an international flight the other day. Everybody was scanning their QR codes and then having their biometric face image taken to match up against their passports. So these are not things that are possibly coming in the future. These are systems that are already in place, that have already been used, that have already been tested to regulate not just whether we have vaccines or not, but to regulate every single aspect of our lives. Now, some years ago, as we were warning about this, we were called conspiracy theorists. We were told that we were being fear mongers. And of course, now we have seen that all of this and more has come about. So, the QR codes and the vaccine passports, another thing that I think is important to point out here is that these things were being planned. These things were underway long before anybody ever heard of COVID. I've got U.S. government documents dating back to at least 2018 where they were talking about the alleged desirability of a vaccine passport. I've got European Commission documents. The European Commission is kind of the hybrid legislative executive branch of the European Union. From May of 2019, proposing that by 2022, every so-called European citizen be forced to carry a digital vaccine passport. So these things have been contemplated long before anybody ever heard of COVID. So when the World Health Organization talks about this treaty, when they talk about these amendments to the international health regulations, when they talk about the digital health ID as a response to COVID, recognize they are lying to you. They are lying to the world. These ideas were being bounced around for years by the very same people who are now promoting them, people like Bill Gates, et cetera. Another really important thread to this that I think we have to be talking about is the push for central bank digital currencies. CBDCs, as they're called for short, are going to be the mechanism that, along with the digital ID, creates essentially a global prison system where access to anything and everything will be controlled. Your purchasing decisions, your ability to access certain places, your ability to access government services. And I think a really illuminating example of where this goes is actually communist China. I do think they're beta testing a lot of this in communist China right now, where they've actually combined all of this technology with something that they call the social credit score. I first exposed this in, I think it was 2014, as they were beta testing this in China before it became ubiquitous. Today, every single citizen of China has a number associated with them based on a whole array of different factors. Some of them rather innocuous, some of them, things that people wouldn't think much about, like whether your phone is regularly charged is actually one of the factors that play into your score. But far more troubling things like whether you have friends on social media who question the government, whether you yourself question the government, whether you have been perceived as disloyal or questioning the narrative. All of these things can impact your social credit score. And as your social credit score goes down, your privileges are revoked very rapidly. So as your social credit score gets below a certain threshold, you're no longer able to get on trains. You're no longer able to travel outside the country. Your children are no longer able to get into a proper school or study at university. So this has enormous ramifications. And what it causes is people to kind of self-censor and to behave themselves the way their overlords want them to behave. So you combine that with CBDCs, right? CBDCs are not coming, they are here. They have already been adopted in multiple countries. Now, a lot of people haven't become, I think, alarmed enough about this because cash hasn't been banned yet. But the very same people who were promoting digital IDs, the very same people that were calling for these programs before they were implemented during COVID, were also calling for abolishing cash long before anybody ever heard of COVID that was supposedly going to be transferred on your currency. In fact, they created what Better Than Cash Coalition back in 2012. I did a major article on this. They brought together the Ford Foundation was the key organization that brought everybody together, but they had the Rockefeller Foundation, the State Department. Actually, the Secretariat was housed at the UN Capital Development Fund, one of the UN agencies. So the UN is involved. You had the major credit card processing companies involved. And so I think people really need to understand, and we in our conversations with lawmakers, with opinion molders, we need to really emphasize that the push to abolish cash and move us toward digital currency, central bank digital currency, is happening in tandem with the push for digital IDs and digital vaccine passports for a very obvious reason. When you combine the two, you have total and absolute control over everyone and everything, to the point where you literally cannot buy or sell unless you comply. And I think there's a naivete out there among people who would otherwise be inclined to resist this. They say, well, I got my 8 boosters or my 9 boosters or my 10 boosters. I forget what number of boosters they're on now. But, I got all my boosters, so I'm not really worried about this. I'll take my digital ID. It won't cause a problem for me. Well, folks, the boosters are just the first step, right? Next, they'll be adding more boosters. Then they'll be adding new vaccines. Right now, they're talking about malaria. And Bill Gates, very conveniently, after releasing an army of GMO mosquitoes in my state of Florida, now he's got a new vaccine for malaria that he's working on. So all of these things are coming together. Don't be deceived by the idea that this is just for COVID or even just for the next pandemic. They will gradually add more and more to this. They'll gradually start adding in the social credit scores. They'll gradually start adding in your carbon footprint. You have credit card companies already calculating your carbon footprint. I was actually at the UN Climate Summit in late 2022 in Egypt. And one of the most stunning things to me, other than the new 10 commandments and all the rest of it, was having the head of the World Health Organization, a well-known former communist leader, come out and say that climate change is actually a public health emergency. Well, if climate change is a public health emergency and any government power grab is justified under the guise of a public health emergency, and you have to submit to using a digital ID to be able to do anything, I don't need to spell out the implications for you. This is an absolute recipe total. One more thing that I'll say on this. I have tremendous respect for Boyle. I've interviewed him many times. He's my go. What he said, of course, is exactly in line with the current thinking, but it is my view, and it's also the view of several founding fathers, and even the Supreme Court has hinted at this. Treaties, even though the globalists would like us to believe treaties override our Constitution, I do not believe they do. Thomas Jefferson talked about the federal government cannot grant itself new powers just by signing a treaty. The Supreme Court reaffirmed that as recently as 1957 in Reed versus Covert. And if you read the text of Article 6, it actually says the treaties made in pursuance thereof. In other words, treaties that are constitutional. And so I think one of the things that we should be emphasizing in our conversations here is that just because Joe Biden signed some international agreement, and even if they're able to get the 2/3 of the Senate to ratify it as an actual treaty, they cannot grab new powers. We have an amendment process for that. So just like they couldn't sign an international treaty to censor newspapers or to shut down our churches, so they can't sign an international treaty to take over all of our healthcare decisions. But again, like everybody else said, go to the Sovereignty Coalition. Excellent organization. Thanks to all the panelists. Thank you, Frank and Reggie, for having me on. Real honor, huge, important topic. And thank you guys for what you're doing.
And thank you for all that you do, Alex. This is a really perfect conclusion, as I say, of this extraordinary panel's presentations. We'll take a few more minutes, if we may, to put some questions to you all. We have 56 from our audience members. I think that's a record thus far, and many of them are very thoughtful and important. We'll try to do justice to at least some of them. You have made the case that we essentially have no option at this point other than withdrawing from the World Health Organization, that digital gulag, if you will, and all that flows from it is now baked in to the law of the United States and to the future prospects for all of us. Just for clarity's sake, and I think you have been very clear in your remarks, but especially speaking to legislators who now think that either they can review this at some point in the future or in the context of a treaty or otherwise, would you just succinctly describe why withdrawal really is the only option at the moment, sir? Alex, let me put the question to you, if I may.
I do think Dr. Boyle is exactly correct. We do need to withdraw from the WHO. I was very pleased that Donald Trump did that. Another option, and I think obviously withdrawing needs to be the end objective, but another option is to have the House of Representatives defund anything having to do with the WHO, not just their budget, but also any federal operations that intersect in any way with the WHO. So defund any bureaucracies that are working with the WHO, that are charged with implementing WHO mandates. I'll speak on this just briefly. I was very encouraged and at the same time a little bit saddened by the news out of the House Appropriations Committee, the subcommittee there on foreign operations and the State Department appropriations. I know this because I just wrapped up a big article on UNESCO for the Epoch Times. They have announced that they're going to terminate funding for a whole range of international organizations. And so this is very good news. UNESCO will be completely defunded. So will the OECD. So will UN Women. So will the UN Montreal Protocol. So will the UN Environment Fund, the World Economic Forum, and many, many others. It also gets rid of all these special representatives, special coordinators, et cetera. But unfortunately, not on that list was the World Health Organization. And that suggests to me that we have not been making enough noise yet. We need to reach out to congressional appropriators and very clear that even if we can't get Joe Biden to withdraw from the WHO, an interim step before we can do that would be to defund the WHO entirely and defund all of the federal programs that deal with it. And it wouldn't be quite as good as getting out of it, but it would certainly be a very welcome step, and it would really neutralize a lot of the horrors that we're talking about here.
I have been told that it may be the case that there's a different appropriations subcommittee responsible for the WHO, the Labor and HHS subcommittee.
Fantastic!
Have yet to wring that out. I think that's the case, and I think that they have yet to mark up their bill. But we need to make a redoubled effort. You're absolutely right to ensure that there is no funding. And if I may just add, one of the points that we can tap as a precedent for the kind of broader prohibition that you're describing is the Boland Amendment, which was designed to stop all government activity in support of the Contras back during the Reagan administration. And that seems to be a very important model for what we need to do here. Especially, and Kat Lindley, you spoke to this point about censorship. It's seemingly well outside of the realm of any of these documents that they would have, among other things, provisions that would prevent misinformation or disinformation or malinformation or whatever. Talk about that against the backdrop of what we've heard is the true totalitarian character of this operation.
When it comes to censorship, especially in science, that's extremely dangerous because science needs to be debated and science needs to be discussed so that we can actually move forward. And the idea that you would have an agency defining what it is and then, your government would actually censor you. What does that mean? If you talk about digital health passport and then the CBDC, global financial CBDC that's coming through, you start introducing this conspiracy theory of social credit scoring, right? It used to be a conspiracy theory, but it's not going to be anymore if that's implemented. And then what does that mean for the population? If you say something wrong on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or in a Zoom conference, can you be censored and can you be punished? And as I mentioned, that goes against our Constitution and the chapter of human rights. So it's a very kind of dangerous zone that we're starting to go into. And then, from my own experience, having grown up in communism, it's a very, I'll give you one simple example. I was raised Catholic, but I was really not allowed to discuss that I go to church at my school. So if you start teaching your children that there are certain things that you can't talk about because you could be punished for them, it's very difficult to imagine that this would still be a free country for all of us.
Amen. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Bell, one of the things that you mentioned, at least in passing, but that I think is really important for us to be dwelling on is the motivation for all of this. There's a lot of talk about global resets and a new world order and global governance even. And yet, one of, it seems to me, the most compelling explanations for it is simple greed on the part of, fat cats like Bill Gates, who is a big funder of the WHO, and Big Pharma, which stands to make even vastly larger sums if this kind of arrangement is set in place. How important do you think that is as a factor? And do you think it is at a time when many Americans are sort of reeling from the consequences of this last pandemic, that may be a motivator to stave off the totalitarianism that these guys have in mind.
You can look at this as a massive business deal by people who have no morals. And if you have no morals, then this is a logical way to manage your assets. So you maximize return on investment by controlling people, instilling fear so that they will do what they wouldn't normally do, and channeling that towards buying your products. And that's very much where we are. So if you look at, during the COVID event, the people who were very strongly pushing for lockdowns, for masking, etc., for these measures that we have never used before, and there's very good evidence are very poor from public health point of view. They are the ones that ended up making unprecedented profits out of this. And it's not a coincidence. The same people have been pushing to divert public health towards this profit sort of commodity-based structure for years before this, and pushing the idea of pandemic preparedness. And it's very much driving what's happening now. So I think it is greed, and greed manifests itself in many ways, just getting more money, in getting power and control over people. And I think that people attribute a lot of different reasons, and there's not one little cabal of people sitting around a table saying, what will we do next? But this is a movement of very greedy people in a world that has increasing inequality, so increasing concentration of wealth. And COVID has allowed these people to amass so much wealth now that they can essentially buy countries and buy governments. So I think that's what's happening.
And of course, the irony is that there's endless talk in all of this about equity and the redistribution of wealth. And obviously, some of that has been a motivator for some of the countries that are going along with this program.
Yeah, and a quick reading of George Orwell explains why they're using that language. It's pretty clear.
Yeah. Back to you, Dr. Graves. Your personal experience being hindered from prescribing medications that you deemed, in your, again, considerably experienced professional judgment, is such an important point for those who are contemplating this kind of arrangement. It's hard to imagine, except we have been through this. We've had a dress rehearsal, as has been used by several of our speakers. If you were, in fact, and I don't mean to single you out, I mean, if medical professionals were, in fact, put in a position where their licenses could be suspended, they could lose their positions, is there any doubt in your mind that presumably the vast majority of them would conform to these guidelines, these diktats, and that the people that they're supposed to be giving their best medical judgment to would presumably suffer perhaps on an even greater scale than we've seen in the course of the pandemic to date?
That's exactly what happened in this last, we call it plandemic rather than pandemic, in this last plandemic, because I had pharmacists who refused to fill my prescriptions for the patients. I had emergency room physicians who refused to get appropriate blood work for the patient when they were coming in and their oxygen saturations had dropped below what was actually life sustaining. And they refused. They absolutely, I have never seen a profession. I did not dream, and I'm sure that Dr. Lindley would agree. I was very surprised how quickly the medical profession acquiesced to the World Health Organization's, actually their recommendations, so to speak. And there was nothing, I want to actually stress this, nothing that was scientifically based that they were actually saying this, such as 6 feet apart, mask. We all know that masks do not filter anything that is less than 0.125 microns. Yet all masks, and this includes the N95, will not filter anything less than 0.3. And so we knew that this was a fallacy, but yet every physician around me and in my area here, the clinics, they all went right along with it and fell in line. I had patients who would actually sign a paper saying that they did not want remdesivir, and yet the hospital went on and gave it to them. I remember one gentleman who said, I know that if I go into the hospital, they're going to kill me, but I can't keep my oxygen up. And so he had signed a paper, yet they gave him the remdesivir. He went into renal failure and he died. I had oxygen companies when I would try to get oxygen to the patients who refused to give any oxygen to a COVID patient. If you had COPD, if you had asthma, that was different. They would deliver it, but they would not deliver in cases around this country. Anyone who had COVID, they were more willing to let them die. And for me, I went into medicine to touch the lives of individuals, to help heal them. And yet my hands in many, many cases were tied. And I can't even imagine what this would be like when this is mandated and the only medications, and I stress that, the only medications that will be available and the only protocols that will be set will those by the World Health Organization, who is directly aligned with the Chinese government, who makes most of the world's medications. People say, well, I get it from India. Well, guess what? India gets most of all their bases for their medications from China. So that doesn't help us either. So yes, Frank, I have seen it. I have lived it. I said it's like watching someone drown in a pool and someone holding back your hands when you could be throwing them a life preserver, but you have to stand by the pool until you stand and watch them actually drown and die. I saw that time and time and time again, during especially the height of the COVID pandemic. Right. And I do not look forward to going through that again.
Well, and as you say, that was under circumstances where the WHO was operating on a voluntary basis.
Right. And with it being mandated, because most physicians, we have to really stress to this, that most physicians now are owned. And what do I mean by that? They're either owned by a hospital corporation, an insurance corporation, and they have to follow those protocols. And those protocols, they mean like the hospitals, some of these insurance companies, they actually get more money if they follow these protocols. And it finally came to the point where our government had said, if you follow these protocols, physicians, then you will be exempted from being legally liable. Well, of course, they're going to follow those protocols. So it just continues on, but it will be much, much worse if we take these steps and make this mandatory.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. Reggie Littlejohn, I've just seen a comment from one of our audience members that in a program with Dr. Tenpenny last night, I believe, Robert Kennedy Jr. was asked about the World Health Organization. And as she put it, that he is very much in favor of stopping our relationship with the WHO. I don't know whether that's true. We'll have to run that to earth. I hope it is. And more to the point, I hope it will be the case that every candidate for the presidency will be asked about what we've discussed here, the degree to which they stand with American sovereignty against world governance, and that we elicit from them commitments to help not only if they become president, but also in the meantime, ensure that the Congress of the United States and the American people more generally are aroused to the need for action here. I'm going to give you, as our co-host, a concluding comment, if you care to, and to highlight anything in particular that you think should be taken away from this extraordinary program.
This has been a really heavy webinar because of the sort of freight of what's coming down on us. Okay, the vaccine passport is here. It's already implemented in Europe. The WHO, the UN are implementing it worldwide. We need to resist the implementation of it here. And the CBDC, the central bank digital currency, is also being implemented worldwide. And next month, in July, the FedNow program is going to be rolled out, which is a precursor to the central bank digital currency. So the infrastructure for a biotech surveillance totalitarian state was set during the last pandemic, and people keep talking about the next pandemic like it's right around the corner. Shouldn't happen more than every 100 years, but is it a pandemic? Is a plandemic? Is it a way for the people who have the greed on the top to snap shut a trap for us? This trap has two jaws. One jaw is the vaccine passport. The other one is the central bank digital currencies. You put them together and we are completely caught. Once that happens, there'll be no dissent. Once our sovereignty is destroyed, there will be no getting it back. So it's really important for people to take action now while we still can. And I would urge everybody to go to two places. One is the Stop Vaccine Passports Task Force website. That's stopvaxpassports.org, and sign our Align Act to exit the WHO. And then the other one is the Sovereignty Coalition, to sign the Sovereignty Declaration, because these are ways that you can get Congress to understand, to alert them to the problem. Most of them don't even know that this problem exists. But knowledge confers responsibility. And we need everyone to share this webinar and share these action items with everybody they know so that we can try to stop this thing before it stops us. Thank you.
Reggie, thank you, especially for your leadership on all of these matters. I wanted just to add one other item to the litany of things that we encourage people to take away from all of this. As was mentioned earlier, there is language. Dr. Boyle spoke to this. I think he was the one who first discovered it, buried in the 1,700-page National Defense Authorization Act of last year, page 950, as I recall, has this Pandemic Preparedness Act. And it is in that act that, as he's pointed out, we find some language that suggests that any framework agreement that the WHO comes up with will be considered binding upon the United States. In other words, pre-approved, without going through the Senate advice and consent, let alone a 2/3 vote, which, as the founders wisely understood, given the real danger that not so much that we would see the government obtain powers, at least in this case, as give powers away via a treaty, but there would be essentially no further action required to have all of this descend upon us. The National Defense Authorization Act is scheduled for consideration in the House of Representatives upon their return after the 4th of July recess. And it seems to me that an amendment ought to be offered up that strikes that statute entirely, not the NDAA, but this item buried in its midst. At the very least, the language that makes that pre-approval binding upon us has to be excised, but probably the whole thing ought to be pulled out and redone. This is a place in which those in this audience, clearly very thoughtful people, as we've seen from the questions, very engaged, can help. And we urge you to do so by both visiting the sovereigntycoalition.org website, the Stop Vaccine Passports site, stopvaxpassports.org, and also to contact your elected officials and urge them to ensure that we get proper congressional oversight of, and that should entail hearings, by the way, and actual approval pursuant to our Constitution of any treaty that changes fundamentally the character of our republic, as clearly the so-called pandemic accord would, coming out of the WHO. So with that, let me just say thank you to each of our spectacular panelists, and their advanced billing by me, I think, has been fully lived up to, and I so appreciate their participation, and yours as well. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dee Dee Loggeson for concluding comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks to all of our panelists, but most especially thank you to our audience for being here and supporting this effort by the Stop Vax Passports Task Force. A video of this webinar will post to stopvaxpassports.org within a day of the end of our program. Please share this program with your colleagues and other networks, and check back for more information on this and other upcoming programs. And while you're there, check out the Take Action tab for actions you can take at once to stop the worldwide advance of CCP-like tyranny being imposed during so-called public health emergencies. And visit the sovereigntycoalition.org to join the effort to #ExitTheWho. Thanks for being here today, and goodbye. Bye.